Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, Chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. Today I welcome back Justin Bronk, now Professor Justin Bronk, who is a Senior Fellow for Airpower and Technology at the RUSI think tank in the UK, and now teaches at the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy. Congratulations on the new appointment, Justin, and welcome back to the show. I do have to tell you, by the way, that the show that you and I did with Jack Watling back in November on the detailed analysis of the Russian air war is one of our all-time favorites with the listeners. So thank you so much for coming back.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I'm also very excited to have with us Dara Massicot, a friend whom I've been trying to get on the show for over a year now, Dara. So glad that we finally made it work. Dara is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and was formerly a senior analyst for Russian military capabilities at the Department of Defense. So welcome to the show, Dara.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, guys, I wanted to have you on because this has been a very eventful couple of weeks in the defense circles with these Discord leaks that have been popping up. But one thing in particular has been really interesting, and it's highlighted something that all of us have been thinking about for a while now. Dara and I have been talking privately about this, and it's been highlighting the problem that we've all been aware of, and that is that the Soviet stockpiles of interceptor missiles that the Ukrainians have for their air defense, namely the S-300 systems, long-range air defense systems, and the Buk medium-range interceptor missiles, are finite. And eventually they're going to run out of them, and perhaps may run out of them considerably sooner than perhaps a lot of people have been expecting. So, Dara, let me start with you. What do you think the implications of this are for the war and for the Russian Air Force? You've been concerned about this issue for quite some time. Whenever this point is going to be reached that they're going to be out of these interceptors, what is that going to mean for Russian Air Force and for their ability to establish air superiority over the battle lines, but also over the rest of the country?
Yeah, this is something that's been on my mind since before the war. I think I wrote something back in December before things kicked off. Fun fact, it was like something I did in the days running up to when my baby was being born. So, the urge to get last minute things done is pretty intense. At that time, I noted that Ukraine was going to need a lot of support defending the skies. These things are not infinite. They originate in Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. And it seems that there has been an effort underway to keep Ukraine supplied with these things. But again, we're talking about going into global stockpiles of these things from countries who are willing perhaps to share them. It's not infinite. What this means is if Russia is going to continue to launch missiles at Ukrainian cities or critical infrastructure targets or forces, Ukraine has to make decisions, and they're going to be increasingly difficult decisions about what to defend. Do I defend my cities? Do I defend my troops? When my concerns are when the strategic SAMs are depleted, that allows Russia to operate with relative safety at high altitudes. And I don't think the Patriots can fill that gap, particularly at the number that we're talking about, and even from a technical capability perspective. And I'm glad that we have Justin on the line too. He and Jack have written about this as well.
So, Jack, there's one design bureau that produces currently interceptors for most of these Soviet air defenses, namely the S-300s. It's Design Bureau Fakil in Russia. Is there any potential for anyone else outside of Russia to produce these missiles? Has that been thought about over the last year, as everyone has known that eventually Ukraine is going to run out of these interceptors, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it has been looked at. Clearly, a lot of the discussions on that are fairly sensitive, but without going into specifics, that there are just a lot of issues around whether you can get around the IP and kind of financial issues as well of setting up production lines either temporarily or permanently in the West for systems either that Ukraine had production capacity for, or trying to reverse engineer and produce systems which Russia produces. And it's again in that category of a lot of things where if it was priority number one and had been for a long time, it could be done. There are plenty of difficulties around it, but that it hasn't. It's difficult enough that it hasn't attracted the level of support that it would require, because there were always more urgent priorities elsewhere. And of course, setting up production for these sort of things, it takes a long time. So it's not something you can suddenly rush into production. A lot more effort, I think, has gone into finding ways to boost numbers of Western systems that can be produced and or supplied and then backfilled from Western inventories. But it's worth remembering Ukraine went into this war, despite being obviously the kind of the David and Goliath comparison. Ukraine did go into this war with by Western standards and European standards in particular, a very large GBAD arsenal.
Ground-based air defenses.
Yeah, ground-based air defense arsenal. So, by most NATO standards, NATO having been used to having air superiority for at least the last 30 years, Ukraine actually has a large surface-to-air missile inventory, and so it's not easy for us to backfill or replace those systems, at least one for one, from Western inventories, just because Patriot is expensive. It's long-ranged, but it's also there isn't enough of it for US requirements, and also there are several US allies who are under regular ballistic missile attack. Saudi Arabia, UAE,
and let's not forget about Taiwan.
And of course Taiwan, and so for Patriot, which is really the only kind of system which has been a mainstay of Western capability over the past several decades, because we've concentrated on that ballistic missile threat, where we have invested in surface-to-air missile systems. It's been against ballistic missiles rather than cruise or aircraft. That Patriot system is still not available in sufficient numbers for US needs, let alone traditional allied needs, and so there isn't the capacity there to backfill all of those long-range strategic SAMs, which Ukraine currently relies on for a lot of its in-depth defense, those S-300 PSPT and V1 systems.
So let's give a little primer, Justin, quickly for our audience, because there's been a lot of different types of Western air defense systems going to Ukraine. You've had the IRIS-Ts from Germany and others going in. You've had the NASAMs. You have the Patriots, as you mentioned, Hawks, RBS-70s, man-pad systems from Sweden, and then the Stingers, obviously. So when you look at that whole complement of different systems, talk us through like the different capabilities and the numbers that we're talking about and where the gaps might lie.
So the kind of upper end of what's been sent so far, stand fast the Patriot. I think 2 batteries of Patriot, which are going in imminently. Those are obviously longer ranged assets, but very much, as I said, focused on the ballistic missile defense space, although they are fairly capable against aircraft. But the kind of upper end of what's there now is the NASAMs and IRIS-T SLM. So both of those are medium range systems. They utilize, in effect, adapted air-to-air missiles for ground launch, and they typically have a very good probability of kill against Russian cruise missiles, and potentially are very lethal against aircraft as well, but only within a relatively limited sort of area. So given how huge Ukraine is, these are systems which can protect something fairly well from cruise missiles. That they tend not to be used against Shaheeds because they're too expensive in terms of the ammunition to be used against
Iranian drones. Yeah,
exactly. The Shahed 136 or Geran 2, as the Russians call it. Those tend to be handled by lower end systems. So those Western SAMs, they work very well against cruise missiles and would be quite lethal against aircraft, but they only cover a relatively limited geographic area because they're medium range. And so given how huge Ukraine is, they're not a solution to that full spectrum coverage that Ukraine requires. And it very much goes back to what Dara was saying at the beginning of, they are having to be very, very careful about how they prioritize what is defended by those systems. And of course, there just aren't very many of them because, as I said, NATO has had air superiority for 30 years over anywhere it was going to fight. And so those sort of medium-range counter-cruise and counter-air SAM systems are just not something we've invested in. So there aren't very many of them, which means that as you look at how many could be pushed to Ukraine quickly, the question very quickly becomes how quickly can you make them, rather than where are you necessarily sending them from, where they currently exist.
And how many
systems,
and how quickly you can make the interceptors for them, right?
The interceptors are a little bit less. So the IRIS-T SLM interceptors are problematic from an ammunition supply point of view because they're having to be made. But the really sort of useful thing about NASAM specifically is that it shoots AMRAAM, so the AIM-120 AMRAAM, which is the sort of default primary medium-range air-to-air missile which Western Air Forces use. And so generally be firing older model AMRAAM, so A's or B's, almost certainly B's. But as a result, there's actually quite a large inventory of those things. It's one of the areas where we do have a reasonable supply of them. So NASAM's the bottleneck is launchers rather than munitions, generally speaking. For the other stuff, Croatal, RBS-70, HVM from the UK, so our vehicle-mounted Starstreak, and manpads of various kinds, so Martlet, Starstreak, Stinger, Purin. All of those systems are capable enough, but they're very short-range systems. So they are useful for providing local cover to battlefield units or point defense around specific infrastructure targets. But they are fundamentally limited in range and in altitude where they can engage, particularly if those targets are fast, because the faster a target that you're trying to intercept is, generally speaking, the shorter your effective range will be with a given missile. All of which is to say, the West has some backfill capability for tactical surface-to-air missiles, so essentially book class tactical SAMs and lower, so things like OSA, but not in huge numbers, albeit the ones that are supplied are generally better than what they're replacing. But in terms of replacing the S-300s, the only kind of analog so far is Patriot, and there's a very limited supply of that can be spared.
Very helpful. Dara, as we've been talking since the beginning of this war, you kept telling me, where's the VKS? Where's the Russian Airspace Forces, which their Air Force is a component? And obviously the air defenses have limited their ability to engage on the battlefield and provide significant cover to the ground forces in Ukraine. Do you expect the Russian Air Force to get much more aggressive as the stocks of the air defense interceptors are dwindling in Ukraine? And what effect do you think that might have on the battlefield?
Yeah, so let me go back in time a little bit. In the early days, when things were chaotic coming through the wires about what was happening, there were a lot of questions about where are the VKS, what are they doing? Why is the Army going in so early when the Air Force has not finished their tasks? Like, why is everything out of sync and out of order here? And when we know a lot about that now, and again, many props to the work that Justin has done on that. His reports are excellent. If you haven't read them yet, you should. They give us a lot of detail about the thinking going on. And the VKS was working very hard. And I don't want to steal the thunder from his report. I mean, he's here, he should talk about it. But the VKS was working very hard at some of the deep strike tasks. And they ended up getting pivoted off that to support the inbound army. The columns were in trouble and they had to do close air support. And then you saw them getting chewed up in various Stinger envelopes, various SAM envelopes. And ever since that point, the VKS has been essentially used very conservatively because they don't necessarily have a ton of solutions here. What's going on? I've said this in a few forums, and I'll say it again here. It's really wild when you stand back and think about this. The Russians have mobilized 300,000 people, and they are in the Donbass fighting, and yet they don't actually commit the VKS in a major way to provide support to those people. And I have to conclude, and again, this is a very cynical place that I'm at this point, a year plus in, is that the airframes are irreplaceable. The people, you can find more. And this is when
this is an age-old issue in Russia, right? That
I know.
people's lives are
I'm not
worthless.
trying to laugh about it, but it's like, you don't want to be so cynical. It's terrible to say it, but you hear the Russian defense minister saying things like, "I have 25 million people I could pull from strategic reserve." He views that as his asset pool, and only several hundred airframes. So those are precious. But still, even now, we don't see the VKS really playing a dominant role, and there's a few reasons for it. Mostly the SAM envelope. They are experimenting, and that experimentation has been constant. And lately, we've been seeing them do experimentations with different types of rockets that they're able to launch from slightly farther back on their side. They've been using them near Bakhmut. They've been using them now increasingly near Kherson and the south. So they're starting to do some things with tactical aviation. Still not a major commitment yet. That being said, final point, as a force, the VKS is still intact. Like, their losses have been single-digit percentage overall. Yes, they've lost squadrons of helicopters and fixed wing, but all in all, that's a single-digit percentage of the total force. It's still a force in being. It's not being used. And this is my concern about what happens to Ukrainian SAMs. If those skies are opened up, this is still something that they have in reserve. There are some who think that, Russia wouldn't use them because that's all they have to defend against NATO. I don't know if I subscribe to that view. I'm still trying to sort through what this all means. I'm curious for Justin's thoughts on this too.
Yeah, Justin, what do you think? I mean, Putin keeps talking about the fact that he's already fighting NATO in his mind. So do you think he would keep that in reserve or not?
I don't think the VKS is being held back or would be held back in reserve for the sake of other contingencies. I think it's being held on the back burner, as it were, as Dara said, largely because they don't have options that are particularly good against those tactical SAMs that Ukraine is still fielding. So because they don't have any game that really works against in the SEAD-DEAD space, they can do a little bit of suppression of enemy air defenses, but not really the destruction bit. The destruction is mostly being accomplished by Orlan 10s with queuing in artillery, ballistic missiles, or Lancet 3.
And the suppression they're able to do somewhat with electronic warfare, right?
To some degree, but also they do certainly conduct EW, although a lot of that blanket EW effect that they're able to apply for SEAD or other purposes also messes with their own sensors and communications. So particularly in the TAC airspace, they have to be a bit careful with not committing fratricide in the EW space.
That's part of the problem, isn't it? When you're fighting a military that's armed with the same systems that you have, right, using the same frequencies.
Yeah, but it's also just, Russian kit, they don't do very good OT&E, so operational test and evaluation work. So even on individual platforms, the EW systems will often interfere with sensors, for example. So that gets worse when you look at, for example, EW systems that are operated by the ground forces interfering with Air Force assets. They also, but they fire quite a lot of KH-31P and older KH-58 anti-radiation missiles for the SEAD role. But that, Ukrainian SAM operators have pretty short elimination periods and move regularly for precisely that reason. So they don't have a very good kill ratio. And as a result, committing the VKS more would just result in losses that, therefore, there's no real point in taking until that SAM coverage is reduced to a point where it's not effective. But I think the war is pretty existential. I think for at least in terms of how the Russian leadership sees it, for them, not necessarily Russia itself, but although we could have a discussion, I'm sure. You guys probably know better than I do how differentiated that is or not in their minds of their own regime survival or leadership survival advice.
They certainly think that, whether it's reality or not, that's almost beside the point.
Right. But so, given the stakes for the Russian leadership of this invasion, having made the catastrophic mistake of starting it, they're kind of all in, and so I don't think they're holding back or would hold back bits of the force for another contingency. I mean, frankly, if they were actually worried about NATO in terms of direct involvement outside of some sort of entanglement that was unintentional, they wouldn't have drawn down their forces in Kaliningrad the way they have. They'd have protested more about Finland joining. I think, in fact, the lack of response there and the fact that they're willing to draw down their forces on the NATO border in the north and in their west, so far, really gives the lie to just shows how disingenuous those arguments about that they sometimes put forward and that useful idiots in the West sometimes put forward about Russia being provoked by a perception of threat from NATO. They don't fear NATO. They know we're defensive. They fear accidentally getting into a war with us, and I think longer term, they fear the balance of power there. But they're not worried about escalation on their flank with NATO at this point, because if they were, they wouldn't have drawn down their forces the way they have. So the Air Force, I think, would definitely be committed much more heavily if they had a chance. If that SAM coverage is allowed to degrade to a point where it no longer poses a prohibitive threat at medium level, then I think we'll see quite heavy VKS involvement. And as Dara says, it hasn't been seriously attrited. Although it's worth pointing out that while their fighter force is pretty much intact, the attrition rates on their ground attack fleets are actually quite significant. It's not that they're not still a big problem, but if you look at the Su-34 fullback fleet, they've lost about 12% of the fleet, which is not nothing. And equally for the Su-25s, yes, they had a lot in storage, but they actually only modernized about 84 Su-25 to SM standard and another 28 to 32 more modernized Su-25 SM3s. So given they've lost, I think, about 25 at this point, that is a really significant chunk of that fleet. But they do have more airframes in storage for the Su-25. So their ground attack fleets have taken not insignificant attrition, but they're still a significant threat in being.
Dara, there's a tendency among the Twitterati to assume that because the Russians have been so incompetent in ground warfare that all parts of the military are degraded by corruption and incompetence, and that even if they get a free slate here to operate their Air Force, that it won't make that much of a difference. Where do you sit on that question?
I think we have to break it up by tasks. So if you look at what I think they could probably do if they had the ability to operate over Ukrainian skies, my concerns are things like the reintroduction of medium or heavy bombers, just dumping entire cargo holds of dumb bombs on cities, like they did in Syria. I mean, there's cities in Syria that no longer exist. So that is a concern to me. Do I think that they will miraculously become better at close air support? No, not because of there's the attrition Justin just talked about, but also this isn't something that was heavily trained for in their training programs. I don't think that there's a ton of competence there. Plus, there's too many stingers and everything else at those lower altitudes that will consistently be a problem, no matter what happens to some of the more strategic SAMs. So those kind of things, I don't think that they will excel at. If they are able to, even if they're able to operate at higher altitudes and do different kinds of missions, I think about some of the successes that they had in Syria. Those were enabled by ground forward air control teams. So these would be like Russian special forces teams or whatnot operating and calling in coordinates and everything else. Those have not, I don't know what is going on with that force. I think it is heavily, heavily attrited. I think they were used for other missions early on, and the casualty levels were high. They were going after different kinds of targets. GFAC has not been a significant part of this war that I can see. So that means that they're not going to be able to hit a lot of things with attrition, even though they have the advanced aircraft available to do so. Hit things with precision, even though they have the aircraft and the airframes available for that.
GFAC for the listeners is ground forward air control, right?
And in terms of corruption and impact on their readiness, I mean, sure, it doesn't just go and fester around in the Russian army and Russian airborne. This is present everywhere. We know that from all the debacles going on in the Black Sea Fleet after, in the run up to and after the sinking of the Moskva and how they handled that. I mean, there's a sickness going on inside their military culture that is not force specific. That being said, the Air Force, I think, just by nature of what it is and what they do, tends to be not quite so adherent and stuck in the Soviet past quite as hard as the Army is. The Army is still very culturally dominant within the Russian military, and I think we see that in terms of, the Air Force should be a major driving force, and it never really was, and it's like they didn't really know how to use it. And I think folks at RUSI's report says that it's like subordinate in some ways to the Army. So where does it go from here? That's a larger question on, where does the Russian military go from here when the active phase of the war is done? I think the Army must be rebuilt because it's destroyed. And what does that mean for, balancing different kinds of threats and who gets procurement rubles and who doesn't? It's my bet's on the Army.
Justin, where do you stand on this question? We've talked in the past on the last podcast with you about the challenges they face with lack of tankers, with maintenance levels, and the impact on the fatigue of the crew. So what do you think the Air Force at this point is still capable of if the skies open up, if you will?
So I think, very much as Dara said, the large quantities of dumb ordnance is mostly what they'd be doing if the skies were more open. But it's worth pointing out that because the war on the ground is really positional at this stage, it's not a maneuver fight. Things are pretty static. It's not particularly difficult to find where opposing positions are, but also crucially, it would be comparatively easy for the Russians to spot, because they know where to look, concentrations of forces massing for counterattacks, localized or otherwise, spot kind of logistics and repair hubs, railheads, ammunition dumps, all of these things which currently the Ukrainians are able to, for the most part, stay ahead of the Russian targeting cycle on. Those are things which, if you were able to tote around at, say, 15,000 feet outside of the manpads envelope, a few tens of kilometers beyond the front lines, those could be, even with relatively limited Russian kind of aerial optics, things like the Platan, spotted because they'll know roughly where to look. And also, for example, things like HIMARS in particular, which is still a crucial part of Ukraine's ability to stop Russia being able to concentrate forces and ammunition where it needs to on its own side of the lines. HIMARS is really visible when it fires. Those missiles make a significant plume, and particularly at night, they're very, very visible. So if Russian aircraft were able to or are allowed to get to the stage where they can essentially patrol, go on kind of interdiction patrols several tens of kilometers beyond the lines at medium level, they wouldn't have to spend long in that Stinger threat envelope, in the Manpads threat envelope, to conduct relatively accurate bomb and rocket deliveries on HIMARS and other visible systems when they fire. Same for artillery. And Russian defensive aid suites, so flares, chaff, being dispensed automatically when the systems on the aircraft detect a missile launch, those generally perform pretty well, with the exception of the Camel 52 helicopter fleet, which seems to have a terrible DAS. But defensive aid systems are pretty good. The reason Russian aircraft are still taking losses to manpads is because of the sheer number fired. It's not that the probability of kill on any one is particularly high. And so if, again, the Russians are able to tote around at medium altitude outside the manpads envelope and only need to dive down to hit targets for 15 to 20 seconds before coming back up to altitude, the defensive aid systems are probably good enough that the loss rates wouldn't be too bad. Unfortunately, at that point, to manpads. So that would be my biggest concern, is the battlefield impact. I think the bombing of cities, absolutely, if they are able to start penetrating that far, they will absolutely go that route, and we've seen what that looks like in Chechnya, in Syria, and of course we've seen what it looked like in Mariupol as well, and Kharkiv early on in the war. So we know what that CONOPS is, but I think the likelihood is probably that the deep airspace in Ukraine will remain pretty dangerous for Russian aircraft for the foreseeable.
Because you will have these Western systems, right, still?
Well, partly that, but also, Ukraine is very unlikely to, and I stress this is not from any of their documents or anything, but just, from a logical point of view, one would not expect Ukraine to keep firing its systems at the current rate until they just completely run out. What you would expect instead is them to start consolidating and prioritizing defenses further into the country and in specific high-value areas. In other words, they will lessen the SAM coverage and to try and control the expenditure rate and eke out their remaining stocks before they completely run out. So, that defense in depth with the really long-range systems and some of those Western systems, I think will remain longer than the tactical edge. The problem with the tactical edge is that's where the VKS could make a serious difference. We've had a lot of discussions in the air power world about why air power has not been a significant factor in the war so far. And I think there are seriously inflated expectations put on what Ukraine might be able to achieve with some Western fighter aircraft in that regard. I don't think that they can be enabled with Western aircraft, given the constraints that would be there, to change the battlefield sort of nature or the tide of the war. But the VKS could. So I think the goal from an air power perspective has to be to keep air power irrelevant in this war. Because if the Russians are able to establish that medium altitude freedom, sort of several tens of kilometers over the front lines, that will be a massive problem for the Ukrainian army.
So you both point a pretty dire picture here for the Ukrainians if this comes to pass. We've talked about how the Western air defenses are not really a solution because of low numbers, particularly of Patriots, that you can provide. What other options exist? Let's start with you, Justin. There's been this long-running debate about F-16s. You've argued that Gripens are a much better aircraft, although there are limited numbers of those. But are Western fighter jets a solution to try to keep the VKS at distance? Or what else can we help the Ukrainians with? What else can they do to minimize the threat of this scenario?
I mean, I think on fighters, I think getting them a squadron's worth even of Western fighters could have an enormous impact in buying out a lot of that risk from the VKS, because the Russians have been very cautious in the air. As Dara said, they don't keep doing things which are just losing them aeroplanes. They back off. They experiment with other tactics and work out other things, and then try something new. And interestingly, a lot of the Ukrainian feedback has been that the VKS is the most professional, the most reactive part of the Russian military. They learn lessons, they adapt quicker and more responsively than the ground forces or the Navy. And in that sense, you wouldn't have to have a large number of successful air-to-air engagements from a small number of Western fighters against Russian combat air patrols or attack sorties near the lines for them to back off, at least for a while. So in that sense, a small number of fighters could have a huge impact in terms of buying out some of that risk from the VKS becoming a dominant battlefield shaping influence in the coming months as that SAM ammunition continues to run lower.
And you still believe that particularly if it's a small number that's required, that the Swedish Gripens, if they could get them, are the best solution, right?
Absolutely. So the biggest issue with the F-16 is, yes, it's got a much larger pool to draw spares and aircraft and training and all sorts from. In that sense, it's easier. But there are two big issues. But the main one is the foreign object debris and landing gear fragility. So the way that the air intake is positioned on the F-16 underneath, it's a very large single air intake right underneath, right under the nose, and so if you ever see an F-16 spooling up on a wet day, you can actually see the vortex that's created as it sucks everything from the ground directly into it. So F-16s typically require very clean, very well-maintained air bases, and the landing gear is also fairly lightweight because it's designed for a good thrust-to-weight ratio. There is no more weight on the jet than there needs to be. So compared to something like an F-18, which is designed to be slammed on and off carriers, or Russian aircraft, which are designed to be operated from very rough strips, the undercarriage is pretty light. It also, ground handling is an issue. So basically what that means is, while Ukrainian air bases could absolutely be adapted and have in the past been used for temporary F-16 detachments, in exchange visits and things, you have to do a lot of work to get those Ukrainian old Soviet pattern runways to a clean enough state to use an F-16 without high risk of foreign object debris going in and damaging the engines. And that is therefore visible. Also, a lot of the smaller strips that Ukraine is using to keep its air force dispersed and moving around to avoid it being targeted are not necessarily long enough, or at least not the right length that you would want for an F-16 with tanks with fuel tanks plus a multi-role loadout. So you'd be looking at resurfacing work on runways and potentially extension work, all of which is highly visible from orbit, as well as Russian human sources. And whereas currently the Ukrainian Air Force isn't really being targeted with any particular priority, Russia has limited numbers of standoff missiles. That's because it doesn't pose a massive threat. And so the moment that Western jets start coming in, you would probably need to expect that targeting policy to change. All of Ukraine's air bases are within reach, because the whole country is within reach of Russia's ballistic and cruise missiles. And indeed, even if you put Patriot, there won't be much Patriot in Ukraine. There'll be other priorities for it. But even if you were to put Patriot to defend a main base that you were trying to set up F-16 ops on, the Russians still have Kinzhal, so the KH-47M2, the air-launched Iskander, and air-launched ballistic missile. So that comes in very fast with quasi-ballistic maneuvering capabilities. And indeed, the later model 9M723, so Iskander-fired ballistic missile that has penetration aids and quasi-ballistic maneuvering capabilities, that's a pretty hard task even for Patriot. And so essentially Russia has the ability to put craters in things that it wants. It can't do loads of them, but if you're having to centralize something like F-16 around one or two bases because you can only prepare one or two to the required standard within the resource constraints, that's quite a vulnerable posture. The other issue is whether America would clear export of later model AMRAAMs, because that's the air-to-air missile. Because for the Russian Air Force fighter combat air patrols, so the CAPs, are at medium to high altitude and often low supersonic, or at least would go rapidly to supersonic if they were engaged. Now, what that means is that you need a lot of energy remaining in the missile when it gets near those fighters in order to complete an intercept. And so when you look at Wikipedia or something, I've seen Reznikov and others quoting ranges like 180 kilometers for AMRAAM. That's not the reality. some of those ranges that you might see written down of, 100 plus kilometers kind of thing, that is in an ideal scenario with a target that's not aware, that's coming directly towards the shooter, and the shooter being at 55, 60,000 feet and supersonic when they launch. So the missile has loads of energy and is essentially going downhill, and is also being fired right up in the very thin air at high altitude where there's very little drag.
Basically, the shoot the fish in a barrel scenario.
Right. But that's what the AMRAAM was designed for, because that's the way that F-16 and F-15 and now F-22 want to operate for the US Air Force. That's the doctrinal sort of aim for AMRAAM, is to be very high, very fast, and use all that energy to lob AMRAAMs as far as possible. And the missile is designed to take very good advantage of those sorts of kinematic circumstances. But in Ukraine, the very, very serious Russian surface-to-air threat, so those S-400s, S-300, V-4s, the medium-range SA-17s, short-range SA-15s, etc., that GBAD laydown is multi-layered and it's very, very lethal to really significant distances behind the front lines. And so what that means is that any Western fighter would also be doing exactly what the Ukrainians are doing right now, in the sense that they would be flying very low. And so that missile, instead of starting out at 50, 60,000 feet and supersonic, will be starting at maybe a couple of hundred feet and probably subsonic or transonic. And it's then going to have to not only start out relatively low and slow in that dense air where there's lots of drag. So, a lot of that missile burn for the 7 to 8 seconds that the missile burns will be used up, just, overcoming that drag. But it will also have to climb, because the target, those Russian caps, are high. And so your actual effective range is going to be very, very limited compared to sort of sticker ranges that you see quoted. And so for F-16, for example, to be effective air-to-air against, and this goes for any Western aircraft, at least one that isn't stealthy, for them to be effective against those Russian caps, they're going to have the longest ranged air-to-air missiles we can give them. Even something like a late model AMRAAM might only give you effective parity in effective range with something like AA-12, so R-77, or AA-13, so the R-37M, which is now one of the regular missiles being fired at Ukrainian aircraft. And there's a question then, okay, so that means AMRAAM, probably late model Charlie or maybe Delta. Is the US going to clear that for export to Ukraine? Because as soon as you start firing air-to-air missiles at the Russians, some of them will miss, inevitably. You don't expect a high probability of kill with air-to-air missiles. That's not the way air-to-air engagements typically work. You'll fire one to put the enemy on the defensive, and then you'll keep closing the distance. You'll fire a second one, you maybe fire a third one. And so it's about wearing them down and getting to that point where the engagement happens, where you manage to actually intercept them. But as a result, you would expect some of those missiles to be coming down in Russian territory. And just as with all the other weapon systems that the Russians have captured, not only will they examine it and exploit it and, update their own defensive systems, update their tactics maybe, but they'll also supply it to the Iranians, to the Chinese, to whoever, wants to pay them for access in whatever way to that technology. And so for the US, late model AMRAAM is what the US Air Force currently relies on for air superiority requirements against China. And so there is a real cost to agreeing to supply late model AMRAAM to the Ukrainian Air Force in terms of definitive sort of measurable impact on US national security requirements. So that's another argument for Gripen, or another European fighter that's compatible with it, because while the same argument also applies to the European Meteor missile, which incidentally has a longer effective range and is also, because it has a ramjet, so it's got power throughout the flight. It doesn't just have that initial rocket burn, so it actually loses less effective range than AMRAAM from being fired low and slow. But it's also a case of, yes, it would compromise the tech, but it would compromise tech that is primarily relied on by Europeans for deterrence against Russia. And there, the argument is much easier to make of saying, well, yes, but Russia needs to be beaten now, so keeping something in the cupboard for deterrence against Russia isn't necessarily a reason to not do this. Whereas for the US, looking at the China threat, it's a more difficult trade-off. So yeah, I think Gripen, it's more tolerant of foreign object debris. It's designed to be much more capable of operations from short and rough strips, because the Swedish dispersal model, it's much easier to maintain. It's got an internal electronic warfare suite that's very specifically built around degrading Russian fire control radars, because again, it's an aircraft designed from the ground up to be used dispersed, outnumbered against Russia in a defensive role. And it's Meteor compatible. It's also got better automation in terms of the way that the systems display information to the pilots, which some really experienced Western pilots don't like, because it takes away some of the granular information. They want to do they want to kind of do their processes mentally.
It makes it easier,
but
right?
for converting people across, having an aircraft that does a lot of that mental maths for you in terms of missile ranges, fuel, positional data, all of that stuff, it would also make the conversion easier. The key is, still the UK and France would have to clear export of Meteor, which is by no means guaranteed. France is likely to be the stumbling block there. And Sweden would have to be funded and collaboratively assisted with any supply, because especially since Turkey is still blocking their accession to NATO, that would have to be dealt with. But you can't expect them to do it on their own.
Yeah.
So it would have to be a sort of joint funding from multiple European and potentially American partners, with explicit British and French support on the weapons and that kind of thing, so that it's a European project rather than just Sweden. And you would still be only looking at maybe 10 to 15 jets that you might be able to get from reserves, from spares, from the manufacturer, that by diverting perhaps other orders. But that's enough to make a serious difference in the air. There are also plenty of potential asymmetric ways you can go after the Russian Air Force. But I've been talking a long time. I'll let Dara jump in.
Absolutely fascinating. We should tell our listeners that you're absolutely not a salesperson for Gripen, right?
Nope.
You're just a big fan of the aircraft for the reasons you've described, particularly for this particular mission and problem. Dara, Let me ask you this. We have not seen the Russians take out the Ukrainian Air Force so far, even though they've faced considerable challenges that Justin has just enumerated in terms of the range of air defenses that the Russians have brought to bear to this conflict, and the VKS is still flying high, even in standoff missions. Why do you think they've not been able to completely destroy the old MiGs that the Ukrainians are still flying? And it's really amazing that they've been able to keep them operational despite all the challenges that they've had. And obviously they've had losses in those air-to-air engagements and from the air defenses, but they still are able to operate on a daily basis, and that's quite remarkable.
Yeah, can I respond to your previous question, and then I'll
please,
to this one. In terms of thinking about how Ukraine can face down this problem, there's other asymmetric ways to deal with it. So Russia has major limitations in terms of the number of launchers. And you see Ukraine trying to grapple with this problem, whether that's the Black Sea Fleet, which launches your Caliber cruise missiles, has a limited ability at any time to launch more than, I think, the maximum any of those ships can do down there is in the single digits. And then you also see attacks on Russian bomber bases inside Russia. They're going after the launchers. This is a more efficient way, if we're just talking about efficiency here, to cope with this problem, rather than sit there and every 2 weeks or every 2.5 weeks, there's another inbound salvo of 40 or 50 objects of various age, or, drones or whatever that they have to shoot down. So they're trying to go after the launchers themselves. The Black Sea Fleet is a major choke point. The Russians have brought in assets from the Caspian flotilla to try to bolster their capacity to shoot Calibers. If those ships are disabled or neutralized in some way where they can no longer launch Calibers, Russia cannot bring in additional naval assets into the Black Sea. The Turks have closed the straits under the Montreux Convention. So that's one.
Or alternatively, Dara, you don't have to go after the ships. You could go after the port facilities where they load the Calibers onto the ships as well, right?
Exactly. And there have been attempts at that. We've seen it. We've seen the aftermath. The Russians, learn from those experiences, perhaps a little slowly, but they eventually learn. There also have been attacks on different routes to deliver munitions to the front line. Russian logistics is adapting to that too. It's not working efficiently. It's working very hard, but it's still working. So there is an asymmetric way to cope with this problem. It just means that Ukraine has to be able to arrange very sensitive targets well inside Russia and in the Black Sea. The Russians have adapted in some ways to that too. They have a lot of air bases, and they're pulling some of these assets back after a couple events have happened inside the Russian Federation. And of course, we all saw the memes of all the Pantsers going on top of all these buildings and everything else inside Moscow, but that is their response. Those are point defense systems. They're going to bolster those facilities. They made mistakes. They're going to try to not make them. I'm sure they'll leave some vulnerabilities open in that sense. In terms of why the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying, Russia has a major problem going after dynamic targets and relocatable targets, and this comes back to structural reasons. Their ISR has serious limitations, whether that's airborne or whether that's orbital. Those targets move. They have. I'm not going to help them improve their targeting, but they've made questionable targeting decisions on Ukrainian air bases from the start of the war, and I'm not going to offer them free advice on how they can improve that. But it tells me that
they have the A50 AWACS, right? So
they do, but they have a small number of them, right? And they have to be available for many other missions if Russia needs them. So they can't, plunge that asset all in on Ukraine and lose more of them if they only have 8 functioning platforms to do. So I think what we're seeing here, Russia, there are so many problems with their targeting cycle. They can't even go after HIMARS despite prioritizing this now since June. Yes, HIMARS are mobile systems, but this was a MOD priority, neutralize these 16 systems, and they haven't done it. And yet they claim that they have, 210% of HIMARS they claim that they have destroyed, but they actually have destroyed
They've
zero.
overachieved the plan, right?
Overachieved the plan by 210%. But again, this goes back to Russian BDA. And there's their battle damage assessment. Whether it's relying on pilots or relying on ground units to report accurately and honestly upwards of, yes, I destroyed my target today. It's clearly not happening. Things are coming into the system that are junk and rattling around in Moscow and influencing their assessments of things. I just don't think, given those limitations, that they are going to risk firing a handful of KH-101s or calibers at an airfield, and it takes the missile however many minutes to get there. At least if it's a cruise missile, it'll take some time, and having those assets relocate, and then it's basically a wasted strike. When it's in their perspective, a sure bet to hit a stationary target like a power station or a city or a wastewater treatment plant. They know where it is. It's fixed. It's not defended or defended very lightly. They'll just keep going after it. I would caution, though, that there is the view that Russia's precision strike campaign to knock out Ukrainian electricity is a failure. It is. It worked temporarily, but then the Ukrainians were able to mitigate the impacts through a variety of means. In that sense, it hasn't worked. In the sense of firing missiles continuously at Ukraine and forcing Ukrainian air defenses to expend interceptors to knock back these Russian missiles, that is successful. And you could think about that in the sense of an alternative method to suppress Ukrainian air defenses, or SEAD. It's that secondary, that I guess from the Russian perspective, the secondary benefit of all of these missile strikes is that over time you force them to make these choices. And that kind of brings us back full circle to the start.
So last question, Justin, and that is the drones that we haven't really talked much about. They're coming in large quantities from Iran. These kamikaze drones, they're causing damage, obviously, to Ukrainian infrastructure. The Russians look to be producing more of their own drones as well. how's Ukraine doing dealing with that problem? And, are the Skynex systems that the Germans are sending, looks like the Israelis may be helping as well. Is that going to help to neutralize the unmanned aerial system problem that they face?
So in terms of the loitering munitions side of things, so the Garan or Shahid loitering munitions, those are being broadly pretty successfully intercepted these days. In particular, Ukraine has had a lot of success with its mobile short-range air defense teams, usually with something like a Shilka or a Gepard, as well as manpads and or even sort of dushkas, so heavy machine guns and searchlights. Also because they've got some clever apps so that where people can ordinary people can essentially quickly report in sightings of UAVs, missiles, aircraft into a sort of centralized data gathering function, and so they're getting better at tracking them. And one of the benefits of Ukraine being so huge is that in order to strike targets deep inside Ukraine, those Shahid or Geran drones have to go a long way, and they're quite slow. So if you can build up a picture of where they're going, which is not easy, but there is often time to station mobile teams to move them to the likely routes and shoot them down. Also, even just people with dushkas are getting much better with those weapons because they've had a lot of practice. And so once you learn how to lead targets, even kind of crew served non-radar laid gunnery can be quite effective. So they are getting better, and it's notable that the Russians have changed their tactics as a result. So instead of kind of drip feeding lots and lots of Shahids for several months, which they did, which primarily served to kind of exhaust Ukrainian air defense ammunition of various kinds, although they weren't ever firing the really big stuff. But the interception rates have got good enough that the Russians are now kind of saving up their production, the Iranian production allocations, until they have large amounts, maybe 30, 40, and then not just even sending them out as a big salvo, but sending a few early in order to try and kind of work out where those air defenses actually are. So they'll send a few to begin with, see what lights up, and then if they manage to work out that there are air defenses in a particular area, they'll then change the routing of the main kind of strike wave to try and avoid it. So that's both an example of Russia learning and adapting, but it's also testament to how effective the Ukrainian defense measures against those now are. So yeah, they're having some success there. The UAV problem at the front lines is more tricky, partly because there's such a variety of systems, from small quadcopters up to the four-post and Orlan male class UAVs. The Orlan is one of the biggest problems because it can fly above the range of manpads and gunnery, and so essentially what that means is, in order to shoot them down, Ukraine has to use SAMs, so radar-guided surface-to-air missile systems like OSA or Buk, and so that is one of the things that's drawing so much of their ammunition capacity. And
there's a huge asymmetry there on cost, right? Those Orlans cost a lot less.
The Orlans cost, I think, about $85,000 to $100,000, give or take. So they're not nothing, but there is an asymmetry also to Russia's ability to keep producing those, vice the finite nature of air defense ammunition as a global supply that can be accessed. So they have to be engaged because the Ukrainians can't leave those Orlans up over the front lines, because when there is a UAV up giving a real-time feed, artillery is just so lethal because it can be very, very rapidly spotted and adjusted to get accurate fire even without laser-guided shells, and they can use laser-guided shells. It's the counter-UAV battle, I think, is probably the most important facet of the sort of, I hesitate to say air war. My instinct is to put UAVs being used for artillery directing into the land environment in my head. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the impact on the battlefield, the ebb and flow of the UAV and counter UAV contest is kind of one of the key determinants of battlefield success for both sides. And so, as you'd expect, there's a lot of adaptation going back and forth. And it is worth noting, as you know, that there are asymmetric ways for those sort of things to also affect the more traditional side of the air war. So one of the things that Ukraine will no doubt be looking at is ways to basically hurt the VKS's ability to put pressure on them that aren't surface-to-air missile systems or fighters that they don't have at the moment in terms of competitive fighters. So things like going after the VKS communication systems, going after their air bases, potentially trying to force them further back because Russia doesn't use tankers regularly to support its tactical fighters or its attack aircraft. If you can force them to use air bases further back, that will significantly limit their tactical options and persistence near the lines.
That was Dara's really asymmetric plan for confronting this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good one. But again, without going into specifics, it's worth noting that one of the asymmetries between Russia and the West, we look at a lot of Western military practitioners and theorists look at all of these UAVs and things like long-range loitering munition type UAVs and go, this is a huge problem. We're not set up. How do we defend against this stuff? We'd need loads. It'd be completely uneconomical to field enough air defenses to have coverage like that. Well, actually, Russia does have that kind of air defense laydown. They have a lot of Pantsir and Tor and SA-17 and older Tunguskas. So, yes, UAVs are absolutely a potential way to put pressure on the VKS, and it's definitely something that's being looked at. But people, I think, often forget quite how lethal and extensive the Russian ground-based air defense laydown is.
Although the Ukrainians have had successes, right? Just recently they had a strike that almost succeeded all the way in the suburbs of Moscow against a gas compressor station, right? That's a huge way to go from Ukraine all the way to Moscow, presumably across many air defense zones that they completely bypassed.
Yeah, I mean, Russian crews are human and often not necessarily...
sometimes drunk, right?
Yeah, I was going to say not necessarily serving in the best possible circumstances, but Russia's a big place. Even their air defense laydown has gaps, but it's also worth remembering that small UAVs are not going to go that far because of the ability to store power, whether it's electric batteries or small gas powered engines. If you want something to go a long way, even if it's quite slow, it will generally have to be quite big. And so the number of UAS and UAV capabilities that can reach out that far is much smaller than the kind of total inventory of small UAVs that Ukraine plays around with very successfully. So yeah, as I occasionally kind of end up coming back to, physics still applies. If you want something to go a long way, particularly if you want it to go a long way fast, it's going to be large and therefore expensive, and therefore you won't have huge numbers of them. Even the Shahed 136, it's not a small thing. When you see them, it's about 200 kilograms. It's quite a big thing, given the perception of these as small, cheap, cheerful UAS. Yes, they are compared to regular things, but the trade-off for their range, even at that size, is that they're quite slow. So yeah, it's there are definitely options there, but it's not as easy as sort of some of the enthusiasts for the transformative power of UAV swarms make it sound. If you want something to swarm, you have to be able to afford large numbers of it, and if you want it to go a long way, it's going to be big, and if you want it to be multi-mode, multifunctional or accurate, then it has to have a seeker, which is expensive even if the airframe is cheap. And if you want it to go through short-range air defenses, you probably want it to be fast and maneuverable, which drives more cost and complexity, and you very quickly end up with missiles in effect. And then why don't those swarm? Well, because nobody can afford them in the quantities to regularly use them in huge quantities. So
everything has trade-offs, and there's no miracle weapon, and there's a reaction to every action, and that's really one of the reinforced lessons of this war that we talk a lot about on this podcast. And on that note, thank you so much, guys. This has been such a fascinating discussion, going so deep into this issue of air defenses. Obviously, a big concern if those stocks are dwindling, but as hopefully listeners heard on this pod today from both of you, there are options that the Ukrainians can take. Some of them will require support from us, so maybe a dozen or so Gripens can be delivered to the Ukrainians in the near future and can dramatically help them in this. And Dara, your plan for asymmetric strikes against air bases and port facilities and maybe ships to prevent the Russians from achieving that air superiority, even with the lack of air defenses, I think is a sound one as well that I'm sure the Ukrainians are thinking through also. So thank you so much. This was great. Hope to have both of you back soon, and enjoy your week.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.